Chapter 7, about the connection between body and spirit. The problem of the realization of the spirit. So far, we know the following about the spirit. Coupled with the living soul in the personal I, it forms the basis of referring acts of reflection, or more briefly, of thinking consciousness, whose carrier is only the historical, and partly still the prehistoric, man. It is found, as far as consciousness is found, and is just as little a part of the living body as this. But now we face a twofold contradiction. The living body, so we heard, is the appearance of the self-soul. But how would it then be the appearance of the personal I? Furthermore, it was shown that only souls can appear. The fact of self-discovering consciousness, however, requires the reality of the spirit to make it possible, and the spirit cannot realize itself in any other way than by appearing. At the same time, we recall what has already been stated above. The point of the thing is set by the spirit, and is therefore pure noumenon. The personal I, however, which performs the setting act, must be an actually existing being. Accordingly, we called it the only possible noumenon, which, moreover, also has the nature of the phenomenon. Should then not only souls appear, but also the spirit? If we consider for a moment the difference of the macrocosmic soul of the images par excellence from the microcosmic one of that special image, which presents itself to us as a living body, and if we think of its most original form, the simple cell, then we will have to consider the soul appearing in it twice, as a mere side of the soul of the universe appearing in the juxtaposition, as well as succession of innumerable images, and, moreover, as a peculiar soul of the always similarly repeating cell image. By virtue of belonging to the universal life, every single living being is connected with the life of the species before, then of the earth, finally of the world. By virtue of its own livingness, it also has a local centre of life, comparable to the place of the apparently constant water vortex. If we take the cell schematically as a sphere, whose special life is designated by the connection of all parts with the one and same centre of the total form, then the independent life of the cell, and consequently of every organic cell structure, proves to be based on the fact that the image is only indirectly connected with the stream of images, namely through a centre which directly determines it. If we finally take the circling around itself with regard to the shape of the planets, we may say that it is the peculiarity of every separate living element of reality to circle directly around its own centre, which for its part only finds itself linked to the life of the outer world, which is spread step by step into the boundless. We refrain all the more from pointing out the great perspectives that could be opened at this point to the understanding of the essence of organic life, since we had to omit the precondition of the whole way of looking at it, namely the process of the embodiment of appearance, which we will have to deal with later on, and point out in passing only the one thing that, compared with the inorganically living, the organically living appears afterwards in the light of an internalization of life, while the latter turns directly to the outside, said in the language of the forces, soon pushing or pulling, soon warming or chilling, inflaming or freezing, illuminating or eclipsing. The latter comes into contact with the outside world only by means of central inwardness, in relation to which the appearing body plays only the role of the receiving and reciprocating messenger. Here, however, we are only concerned with the solution of the captious question, which can only be justified by such a consideration: how the extra-space temporal spirit appears in the reality of the appearance. If the sphere circling around its own centre is the glyph par excellence of the life-bearer, and its centre is that of his special soul, then on the other hand, the covetous light-bearer has exchanged a new centre, around which the previous centre must now also circle. The covetousness would therefore be eccentricity of the soul. We may recall that even today characters with an incalculably dissolute unreasonableness are called eccentric, and thereby indicate that in them there has remained an eccentricity that is expected to hold the centre, namely the spirit. The sentence that only souls can appear remains unrestricted, because it is not the spirit that appears, but the I form of the soul. But this consists in a shift of the centre of life. Unnaturally spoken, the personality form of the special life is based on that reorganization, which cannot be compared with anything else, according to which the experience is divided into a chain of experiences of the existing ego, and the reality of the events to be experienced is already, with the mere act of perception, necessarily interpreted in the sense of the capital E existence of things acting on each other as on the soul. In other words, there is a peculiarity of the soul that cannot be understood from life alone, including, of course, its form of appearance, for the explanation of which we need the assumption of the extra space-time spirit. It is not the entity, which is alien to reality, which expresses itself or appears, but the result of its effect on the soul, which is exclusively capable of appearing. Since the theory of appearance is, among other things, physiognomics, it is advisable to indicate, at least roughly, how the imagined shift of the centre is expressed in the structure of the living body. The spiritual party of mankind, without exception, transfers the seat of the soul into the brain, where, of course, first of all the whole of the body is its appearance. But this erroneous view has the appearance of a reason for itself, inasmuch as the brain, more exactly the cerebrum, forms, however, the place of the consciousness. Therefore, its overemphasis in the construction plan of the body corresponds to the control of the life according to the side of the spirit, and thus to the arrangement around the personal I. The brain lies in the skull, and the skull lies peripherally. The peoples of antiquity, who were no less savages than those living today, transfer the seat of the soul, which to them justifiably coincides with the principle of life, sometimes in the liver, sometimes into the diaphragm, sometimes into the breath, sometimes into the blood, but quite primarily into the heart. In relation to the brain, the heart is a centrally located inner organ, whose continuous, not actuated, but happening oscillation does not make an act of consciousness possible, but most precisely expresses every slightest surge of the soul, and also overpowers the brain, without which it would have to wither the nourishing current of the blood. The old speech of the opposition of heart and head has by no means only a figurative sense. The shift of the centre of life into the ego appears physically in the growing predominance of the cerebrum over the heart, and the ganglionic plexus. If we hear from the antiquity of many ecstatics that they would have glowed in a state of enthusiasm at the whole body, so we see in the spiritual religion of Christianity the luminous aura only wreathing the head of the inspired, and finally hovering over it as a fading crown of rays, a real symbol of the transfer of life to the eccentric place of the spirit. About the proof of action of mechanics, quote-unquote proof of action. Why and how it happened that within the prehistoric people at some time the extra space temporal spirit, let me re-emphasize that, extra space temporal spirit, i.e. a spirit that's outside time and space, was able to work first into the space-temporal life cell is a riddle which cannot be solved today yet. But after it has happened without any doubt, we are now able to state how in the cosmos the spirit comes into effect. Neither does it act on things, nor do things act on it, since it is rather it that has transformed the flowing reality of the appearance only for us, its bearers, into the world of separated things equipped with self-assertion. On the other hand, if it already entered the cell of life, then it necessarily affects the life in us in a sense of a metaphysical, but not a physical effect, and that by usurping power over the centre in the direction of displacement of the soul, and thus ultimately to the desecration of the body. Our life, which is thus partly divided into itself, has an equally soul-dividing and consequently destructive effect on the cosmic as well as on the organic life of the surrounding reality by means of its appearance, i.e. of the living body. To the same extent that an ego-shaped soul, by taking possession of the stream of images, has to cut it into things that resist each other by means of ego points that are interpreted into it, and thus falsifies the events with the concept of a machine, its volitional attitude, through the mediation of the living body, aims at the real mechanization of the course of the world. But this can only be achieved at the price of the disenchantment of the image, or the de-imaging of the soul, in a word, the murder of life. As from the received image, the judged thing has become, so in the place of the spawn of a creating activity, the essentially always negating and therefore killing deed takes its place. The proof of the negating essence of the deed, because it requires a complete doctrine of the will, would go far beyond the scope of this investigation, and only with the reference to some effects it may be illustrated that every will is accomplished in destruction. Before that, however, since the desirous life-bearer seems to prove himself, as it were, by force and by far-reaching deeds, we have to touch upon the question, which can hardly be avoided, how acts of will are to be realized at all. How can the mechanical intervention, one could ask, change reality, if the object of this intervention, the thing, is merely a fiction? To this one would first have to reply, as certainly as the thing is a setting of the mind, so certainly it is a really experienced thing in regard to which this setting happened. It forms the assumed point of relation of spatio-temporal sequences of appearances. The point of relation is imagined, but what has changed in relation to it in properties of species are images. Whoever sees a colour-stained cardboard on the wall, where others see the painting of a landscape, and scrapes off the colours in order to explore them chemically, is neither willing nor able to meet the landscape directly, because he has no knowledge of it. But he meets it indirectly just as thoroughly as if he had perceived it and intended its destruction. The alleged proof of action of mechanics is just as old as a mankind's thinking in concepts, and has just as long rarely failed its persuasive power. When, before Massilia, the legionaries hesitate to cut down the ancient sacred oaks of the Gauls, Caesar himself steps forward and takes the first mighty swing of the axe. And, because now no thunder strikes down the sacrilegious man, the Roman warriors are soon convinced that the demon of the tree does not exist at all, or that he is killed, or at least condemned to impotence. But had Caesar really disproved the demonic soul of the tree whose felling he had succeeded in bringing about? He had done it as little as he refuted the landscape picture, who saw only Kremnitz white and emerald green in its place, and destroyed the picture, of course by removing the colour spots. One should note, however, we speak here of the demonic soul, thus of a magic power, and by no means of a so-called aesthetic impression, this most abominable figment of the brain. One is accustomed to look at the images from the point of view of thinghood, and at the events from the point of view of a legal sequence of movements of things that every proposition representing the reality of the images meets with the prejudice, which is difficult to defeat, that the name image, only the visible outside of the thing is meant, including, for instance, their effect on the feeling of the observer. Now, the conception of things depends on a perception that remains unconscious throughout, and on the perception that is not observed in the majority of cases, in that both the properties of the species in and for themselves, as well as their respective special epithets, were co-determined by the coercion that happened to the mind through a sensual experience. If now the surface of the thing, as the only thing that can be experienced, builds the bridge to the image, so to speak, it belongs to the thing no less than its material properties. It is divided according to colour, shape, and tactility into nothing but qualities set by the spirit, thus limited, or, if it pleases better, formed, namely, of the existing one of the thinkable thing, which persists resistively in the time stream, whereas the content of the image, which is only to be experienced, is a wave of the unboundedness of the stream of reality, and thus an appearance of the essence of the world. Because it is an object of thinking, the thing, together with all its properties, of its material as well as of its surface, is found again by any bearer of perception at any hour as always the same something, while the, if it is allowed to say, archetype of it, because it is only to be experienced, it never returns a second time, even for the same observer, and in order to be experienced in such a way that it can be known as the act of recollection, it not only requires a readiness for conception that has become rare today, but also that favour of the moment that is not brought about by any effort of human arbitrariness. In a mankind of the triumphant intellect, which, Pauline speaking, has almost only pneumatics, it is difficult to speak convincingly of facts, which are only accessible to the psychic, but which appear to him far more self-evident than our belief in mechanics. The whole antiquity, like still today every natural people, knew not only human souls, but even more demonic souls, and has left us exact testimony how such souls used to appear to the observer. Accordingly, the demonically animated image stands in the nimbus, which means as much as in a luminous cloud surrounding it, which is why today we occasionally still speak of the nimbus of a personality, and more clearly of a radiant beauty. If we transfer what we experienced at that time with full visual power into a form of communication more adapted to present-day man, namely by the example of the Celtic oaks revered as divine, then we may perhaps hope to prevent for once the tendency to confuse the living image with the lifeless precipitation which the conceptual act of the mind retains of it in the seeing thing. If in the fertilizing moment the psychic, instead of only perceiving the oak, be it with or without aesthetics, is able to see its archetype, then a demonic soul has appeared to him by means of the same fact, which means to us the tree graced in such or such a way, or has really felt as overwhelming the fluidal shudder which roars mysteriously down from the treetop. This may be valid for the nimbus in the limits of a character formation, to which at most the knowledge of the suprapersonal content from the depth of swelling feelings makes it possible to find back, groping and guessing, to the contemplation of the experience of seeing. After that, the mechanical intervention in an extra-mechanical reality presents itself more clearly as follows. Having become soul-blind for the nimbus, the pneumaticist still perceives the certain tree, including the atmospheric circumstances of the moment, but as cut out of the pantheon of life by spatially and temporally, peculiarly and species-wise marked borders. Thereby the quote-unquote archetype of the tree has changed up to the core. In the place of a demonic living being which holds dialogue with stars and storms, the world-torn one of the generic thing took place, whose supposed own life disintegrates into the machine-like play of energies, which are to be measured in front of the more insistently probing look of the understanding. Nevertheless, this mask is also again the archetype for the other time, but robbed of its nimbus, peeled out of its veil of Maya, stripped of its protecting, because into the whole interweaving cover, become naked, disenchanted, and henceforth lacking the ability to make itself audible of a human soul. And therefore the deed directed at things will nevertheless do violence to the image of the world, and because it blindly smashes the appearance, will smash the appearing soul with it. Although all parables are lame, this side of the matter is also illuminated with a parable in the end. What would all the books of mankind be for a new generation which, although otherwise gifted in the most manifold ways, would not have the slightest idea that there are characters, with the help of which one is able to banish the most fleeting flash of thoughts into an eternal present? If men were extinct but their books still existed, and if the new generation came, it would see the same thing on the printed pages that we saw there, or at least it could see it insofar as it fell to carefully reproducing types and lines, and yet it would not hear the least of the thoughts that spoke from them to those who knew them. And if it burned all the books, it would destroy, among other things, the deepest wisdom teachings, although it would have destroyed in its sense only whimsically ornamented paper. But as this would in no way have disproved the meaning of the characters, nor their inherent ability to effect revolutionary destinies among those who would have known how to read them, so it proves nothing against the extra-mechanical and animate nature of the images, that they can be destroyed by mechanical intervention. The mention of an outrage on the tree cult may have served as an example for our thesis of the negating essence of the deed. Although the preceding discussions already tacitly include a main part of the reasoning, insofar as they clearly show that the activity of the will is, as it were, the practice of that abstraction for the faculty of judgment, the actual purpose of which is the elimination of the soul. The imposing memory of so many good and excellent deeds would still have to be fought with more weighty reasons. The machine, nature too, but nature outwitted and forced to subjugate itself, can destroy life, but never generate it. That we grasped reality truly, because we conquered it mechanically, would be true only in a denaturalized world, which for its part would also be a machine, whereas the corresponding proof for a living world would be furnished only by the generation of life, by way of performance. But as little as we breathe life into a dead person, so little is it even conceivable that we would ever create a machine which would feel. And does not the most cursory glance at the real facts show us that tool and machine are fighting the kingdom of the living, exterminating organisms in enormous numbers, devastating the face of the planet at an ever more frantic pace? Did we penetrate deeper into the essence of the eagle's soul, since we have shotguns to exterminate the eagle? Did we unveil the secret of the high forest after we built factories that soon turned even the last one into newsprint? Would we solve the riddle of the liquid, because we know better how to dam lakes, how to channel streams in the twinkling of an eye, and how to use the sacred element of the ancients only by horsepower? If, however, the mechanization of nature, instead of enlivening, rather grasps at the roots of all life, then we must not persuade ourselves that it is the crown witness of true natural science. On the contrary, we have to take this from such experiences, that in contrast to the energies and substances, the life is no quantum, which here devoured in one form, there appears again in another. Energetic processes can be reversed, because they are time-drawn appearances of the event, and so to speak its mimicry. In the temporal reality of life, no eternity brings back the second, and even the omnipotence of a god does not wake up again what the murder blow of the will felled. Energies preserve themselves because they are lifeless. Life builds on the world of eternal change, where the concept of preservation finds no place. The, quote, proof of the deed, end quote, therefore looks somewhat different than one generally assumes. As we are able to calculate from the real only that which is constant for us, time in it, and as it were in the frame of its lifelessness, so we certainly conquer nature mechanically, only in the measure of the extermination of the life in it. As much as such examples and considerations might persuade the sympathetic reader to follow them, we are nevertheless prepared for the objection of the philosophically trained, why, on the basis of the doctrine of the soulfulness of the appearance par excellence, there can only be talk of life destruction, since according to it also the corpse of the animal, the corpse of the plant, infallibly falls back to the appearance of a non-organic reality soul. To this shall be replied here only with a hint. First of all, however, one wants to keep present, for example, the Canadian forests of towering giant firs, and in the midst of them, on a cleared clearing, the confused throng of rod-thin chimneys of a smoking factory town. One imagines the Colosseum demolished, and a pale whitewashed block of houses with workers' apartments erected from the stones at the same place. Turn your gaze to the many-storey hotel barracks that the brutal greed for profit has actually erected under the starry sky of the Egyptian desert in the face of the pyramids, and ask yourself whether the natural harmony of the images has not been torn apart and turned into a piercing discord. If it remains true 100 times that some being must appear also in the factory chimney, in the chalky block of houses, in the hotel barracks, but not less that this is a being which attacks the life, how this can be understood, the following suggestion must suffice here. Insofar as the spirit could realize itself in us, our life as well as our appearance is fissured, and this means that the original life of the soul is fighting in us with the parasitic life of the spirit. Now, to the extent that we act out of it through the mediation of our corporeality, that is, behave in a willing and doing way, we carry the same cleavage into the image of the surrounding world. The mechanical intervention, always a form of iconoclasm. Wars by self-division of life against the originally living image with parasitic living deformities, thus suffocating reality under phantoms, the appearance of the soul under larvae, which feed the possibility of their existence, and the mocking appearance of liveliness, however from the blood which they have vampirically extracted from life. Of fate. For a moment we have to dwell on a question of doubt, which also the heartfelt reader is most probably inclined to raise. If the image standing in the nimbus is supposed to be a magic power, so he would like to argue, then a factual correspondence must be found to this power in the world of things. Our whole explanation seems to amount to the fact that, as a result of the weakening of the spiritual life in man by a parasitic intellectual life, some bond has been torn that originally existed between the world of images and the image soul. If, therefore, a soul-poor mankind dares to touch sacrilegiously, and destroys blindly what it formerly took in adoring and loving care, still the images must have the metaphysical powers by which they are enabled to exert influences, partly on each other, partly on the soul of man, from which, however, consequential phenomena in the world of things could not be omitted. Now, we want to call this power by its name, according to its mode of expression in the world of facts. And if we should speak in riddles, then we may recommend such to the reader for a long contemplation. What works from the power of the reality of events of the images into the mechanical world of things is called fate. And because the fate becomes the heavier, the more terrible, the more hotly between both worlds the murderous fight broke out, so fate almost always means doom. We ask in advance, can our science, which calculates everything and anything, also calculate fate? Has ever a man, has ever a nation, calculated its future in advance? Have not, if at all, only the Cassandras, the seers of the world, gifted with their own torment, known it in advance? Did not every fate always turn out differently than the arithmetic sense believed to be able to calculate it? Mankind mechanistically destroys life, but it will perish by its victories. It will end by the revenge of the Erinyes. Quote, what he weaves, no weaver knows. End quote. If there had been a druid among the watching Gauls in front of Massilia, his faith in the living demon of the tree would not have been shaken by the fact that he saw the sacred oaks sinking and the felled ones triumphing without punishment. But he would have waited for the doom that from now on hovered over the head of Caesar, indeed over the eternal Rome. And perhaps, if he had heard later that Caesar, at the height of his glory, succumbed to Brutus's dagger thrust, he could have thought to know this was the revenge of the demon. But who would want to refute him? Only one who would have calculated Caesar's fate would be able to. But no mortal can do that, and never will be able to. Schiller thought that the world history was the world judgment, and he understood it erroneously morally. Fate, however, is not a person, not a human judge who would reward and punish according to good and evil. Viewed in this way, only chance. The evil, as well as the bad, 1,000 times subjugates from the robber baron's castle of the success of the chain-covered slave armies of bruised good, and dies after a fully fattened existence, gently and senselessly in the highest age, and the worst peoples will still always and forever exterminate the better ones. Nevertheless, there is a retribution of the fate, impenetrable to judgment, and metaphysically Schiller was right. Rome conquered and subjugated the earth circle in order to perish at the rottenness of the subjugated. Spain assassinated Atahualpa, the last Inca and son of the sun, in order to perish on the captured gold of Peru. France cut off 3,000 noble heads on the Place de la Concorde in order to perish on the inheritance of the Revolution. The ways of fate no human reason can understand, and for the second time, what he weaves no weaver knows. This is the proof of action of the adept, but against mechanics and arithmetic. And one last word. What are in the framework of this worldview those apparently history-making doers of mankind who mark the turning points of its disastrous course? The legendary Nimrod, Heracles, Theseus, the historical Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Constantine, Charlemagne, Frederick the Great, Napoleon. Finally, the creative high priests, the inventors of deceptive values, Confucius, Manu, Moses, Buddha, Zarathustra, Socrates, Paul, Muhammad, Luther. Nothing but executors of destiny. They believe to be driven, and they are driven. And what they consciously strive for is always immeasurably different from what they actually achieve. They also do not know what they weave. There is no philosopher of destiny yet, for there have been, up to now, almost only philosophers of being, but hardly any philosophers of reality, not counting a few attempts, among which the steepest happened in the name of Friedrich Nietzsche, which surrounds his writings with an enigmatically threatening appearance in spite of their deep brokenness. But the symbolic thinking of the early times revolved around this most abysmal of all problems, and from it a ray penetrated the Greek tragedy, which, when asked about it, could give us better insights than that quite erroneously read out idea of guilt atonement, with which the life-casting sinfulness era of Christianity captured even the poets. Insisting on the freedom of the will, we have become slaves of machinalism. To prove that the entire antiquity was basically pathic-minded, it may suffice to recall those powers to which all people, still close to the source, thought of the birth and death of man, even sometimes their gods. The Moias of the Greeks, the Fortunae, Fati and Partzin of the Romans, the Belisana and the fairies of the Celts, the Wala and the Norns of the Teutons. If all of them is reflected, among other things, in all of them is reflected, among other things, the belief, rooted in the depths of life, in the mysterious, incalculable workings of a destiny that not even divine arbitrariness, let alone human arbitrariness, would be able to resist or escape. And who recognized this now again, he can want nothing more, unless his work, and looks only with horror at the insanity of the doers. And because he no longer stands in the life with his mind distracted, that would mean in the lasting ecstasy, where there is no more searching, questioning, striving, judging, willing. He becomes an observer of life who avoids doing deeds. Having to want is the characteristic of blindness. No longer being able to want is the characteristic of de-blinding. And if one asked him, what should we do? What must we leave? He could only answer this: keep ready and worthy of the moment of conception, and even if it should never come, you did the only thing you were able to do in order to save your soul.